I'm starting a new investigation. I was researching construction photography from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, specifically looking at labor practices and workforce demographics during what was supposedly the largest construction project of the 19th century. Standard historical research. Nothing controversial. 214 buildings erected in 26 months across 690 acres of former marshland. The official story is well documented, unquestioned, taught in every architecture school as a triumph of industrial age engineering. But in March 2003, a graduate researcher found something in the Chicago Historical Society archives that changed everything. 37 letters between Daniel Burnham and his contractors, dated 1891 through 1892, using language that only makes sense if they weren't building something new at all. Letters referencing existing foundation work and adaptive integration and pre-existing structural elements. Not construction language, adaptation language. The researcher filed an inquiry asking for access to the complete contractor archive. That was 21 years ago. The materials are still listed as under review, with no explanation. The researcher herself vanished from every academic database. Her thesis was never filed. And the inquiry generated secondary correspondence between the Historical Society and the University of Chicago that was archived in 2004, then removed from digital archives in 2011. The files still show in metadata 247 megabytes designated Exposition Construction Anomalies Research, but every attempt to access them returns a 404 error, not deleted, just inaccessible. And what you're about to see isn't conspiracy theory. It's a forensic examination of physical evidence that institutions have spent a century making sure you never look at closely enough to see what's actually there. Start with the photographs themselves, not the sanitized versions that appear in history textbooks, but the original glass plate negatives held in archive collections across 3 continents. The Library of Congress holds 1,247 images from the exposition, catalogued between 1893 and 1894. Image LC-USZ 62-103842 shows the agriculture building from the northwest corner, taken on May 3, 1893, 2 days after opening. The building spans 500 feet by 800 feet. The photograph shows complete architectural detail, every cornice and column fully realized, every decorative element in place. But look at the ground-level entrance, and the marble steps show wear patterns. Not surface scratching from 2 years of construction traffic, but concave depressions in the center of each tread, the kind of erosion that requires decades of foot traffic, thousands of people walking the same path until stone itself gives way. The exposition lasted 6 months. Those wear patterns suggest 50 years minimum. The marble itself, according to the official record, was quarried in Vermont and installed in March 1893. The wear pattern predates the installation by half a century. Nobody asked how that was possible. Nobody documented the anomaly. The photograph simply exists, showing what shouldn't be there. The metalwork presents an even deeper problem. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building featured 17,000 square feet of decorative ironwork in the central dome structure, whilst the official supplier was the Passavant Iron Works, contracted in June 1891. But photographs of the dome interior, specifically image LC-USZ 62-103856, taken in August 1893, showed joinery techniques that Passavant didn't develop until 1918. Riveted connections with specific head patterns, structural reinforcement methods documented in engineering journals from the 1920s. The photographs show these techniques in 1893, 3 decades before they appeared in the technical literature. Either the photographs are mislabeled or the timeline is wrong. The Chicago Historical Society verified the photograph dating through developer marks and plate composition. The dates are correct, which means the techniques are impossible, or the techniques existed before we claim they were invented, and someone at Passavant was using methods that wouldn't be discovered for another 25 years. Then there's the question of the trees. Every photograph of the Court of Honor shows mature landscaping, not saplings, not recently planted specimens. Mature oak trees with canopy spread suggesting 40 to 50 years of growth. Image LC-USZ 62-103821, dated April 1893, shows the peristyle colonnade with a massive oak in the foreground. The trunk diameter measures approximately 36 inches, based on the scale reference provided by the human figures in the frame. Dendrochronology is precise. An oak tree reaching 36-inch diameter in the Chicago climate requires 45 to 55 years, depending on growing conditions. The exposition site was marshland until 1891. The transformation from marsh to park occurred during the construction period. Those trees would have been saplings at best, transplanted specimens no more than 15 to 20 years old, even if they'd been moved from established nurseries. Yet every photograph shows mature specimens. The official explanation: they were exceptional examples of rapid growth. The photographic evidence: they were already there. Chicago wasn't an isolated case. Once you start looking at World Exposition photography with attention to these details, the pattern repeats across continents and decades. Paris, 1889. The Eiffel Tower gets all the attention, but the Exposition Universelle included 61 structures across 237 acres on the Champ de Mars. The official construction period: 18 months, from January 1888 to May 1889. The Galerie des Machines, the largest structure after the tower itself, and covered 420,000 square feet under a single iron and glass vault. The engineering was attributed to Ferdinand Duter and Victor Contamin, working with engineering methods considered cutting-edge for the period. But photographs held in the Bibliothèque Nationale show foundation work that predates the official site preparation. Image ESTEI-13-3472, catalogued as showing site preparation, February 1888, contains a visible marker stone in the lower left quadrant. The stone shows weathering and lichen growth inconsistent with recent placement. Comparative analysis with other dated Parisian structures suggests the marker had been in place for 30 to 40 years minimum. The gallery was supposedly built on cleared ground. The photographs show existing infrastructure that someone was building around, not on. The San Francisco 1915 presents an even more explicit case. The Panama-Pacific International Exposition covered 635 acres in what is now the Marina District. The Palace of Fine Arts, designed by Bernard Mebec, became the only structure to survive past the exposition closure. Official narrative: construction began in 1913, completed in 1915. Building permit filed February 1913. Foundation work initiated April 1913. But photographs in the San Francisco History Center collection showed the palace structure in earlier images, not under construction. Completed. Image AAB 3847, officially dated 1912 Market Street panorama, shows the distinctive rotunda of the Palace of Fine Arts in the background. The image was catalogued in 1941, and the dating was based on clothing styles and visible storefronts in the foreground of the Market Street scene. That the palace appears complete in 1912. Construction didn't begin until 1913. When questioned about the discrepancy, the History Center recatalogued the image as date uncertain, circa 1915 to 1920. The clothing styles didn't change. The storefronts didn't change. Only the official explanation changed to accommodate the structure that shouldn't be visible yet. St. Louis, 1904, follows the identical pattern. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition covered 1,272 acres in Forest Park, making it the largest World's Fair to that date. Construction timeline, 3 years, from 1901 to 1904, 200 buildings. But the Missouri Historical Society archives contain surveyor maps of Forest Park from 1898, showing structural foundations in the exact locations where exposition buildings would later appear. The maps were commissioned for park expansion planning and showed existing infrastructure that the planners worked around. The maps were filed in 1899. When the exposition plans were announced in 1901, those same foundations became the sites of new construction. The surveyor notes from 1898 describe the foundations as remnant structural elements, origin unknown, estimated age 50 to 100 years based on material composition and degradation. The notes were filed with the city surveyor's office. They were removed from public archives in 1923. The removal was documented in transfer logs, but no explanation was provided for the reclassification. Buffalo 1901 adds another data point. The Pan American Exposition covered 350 acres. Construction period officially 20 months. The exposition was demolished in 1902, just 1 year after opening. But photographs from the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society show something the official record doesn't mention. The demolition crews weren't dismantling temporary structures. They were demolishing permanent buildings. Image B and ECHS-1902-447 shows demolition work on the electric tower in November 1902. The photograph captures a cross-section of the tower's wall during deconstruction. The wall section shows layered construction techniques, multiple periods of modification, foundation work extending far deeper than temporary structure engineering would require. The demolition foreman's notes, preserved in the Historical Society collection, describe the demolition as unexpectedly difficult. Structural elements require techniques appropriate for permanent masonry rather than exhibition framework. The notes were filed with the exposition's final accounting records. They weren't included in any official report. Why does this matter? Because we're not talking about anomalies in one location. We're looking at a systematic pattern across 4 continents and 3 decades. Identical architectural styles appearing simultaneously in disconnected cities. Construction timelines that violate engineering reality. Photographic evidence of structures existing before they were supposedly built. And in every case, the documentation that would explain these impossibilities is either missing, restricted, or recatalogued to eliminate the contradiction. That's not coincidence. That's not poor record keeping, though that's systematic erasure of evidence that threatens a fundamental narrative about the development of industrial civilization in the 19th century. What if the expositions weren't showcases of new construction capability, but demonstrations of existing infrastructure that had been repurposed? What if the 19th century World's Fairs were actually salvage operations, taking structures that already existed and creating narratives that attributed them to contemporary builders? The evidence makes more sense through that lens. The impossible construction timelines become irrelevant if nothing was actually being constructed. The identical architectural language across continents becomes explicable if the structures shared a common origin civilization, rather than being independent creations. The weathering patterns, The mature landscaping and the advanced engineering techniques all align with structures that were already there, being adapted and relabeled rather than built from nothing. Consider the engineering mathematics. The manufacturers building in Chicago covered 1,687 feet by 787 feet with a clear span roof, making it the largest building in the world at the time. The roof structure used 17 iron arches, each spanning 368 feet. Modern structural analysis of the design shows it required engineering calculations that wouldn't be standardized until the 1920s. The load distribution, the material stress tolerances, the thermal expansion compensation all depended on mathematical models that didn't exist in available form in 1891. Daniel Burnham was a brilliant architect, but he wasn't working with prescient knowledge of engineering developments 3 decades in his future, and either he independently developed advanced structural engineering principles that wouldn't be formalized for another generation, or he was adapting a design that already existed. If he was adapting rather than creating, that raises an obvious question. Who built the original? And why does the historical record contain no mention of the pre-existing structure? The architectural unity provides another angle of analysis. The expositions from 1889 to 1915 shared a distinctive aesthetic: neoclassical revival with specific ornamental patterns, consistent use of colonnade structures, identical approaches to dome construction, and repeating motifs in decorative ironwork. This style appeared simultaneously across Paris, Chicago, Buffalo, St. Louis, and San Francisco. Official explanation: architectural influence and trend adoption among the planning committees. But architectural styles don't typically appear fully formed across multiple continents without development period. Gothic architecture took centuries to evolve from Romanesque precedents. Art Nouveau developed over decades with clear regional variations. The exposition style appeared complete and consistent within a 10-year window with no developmental arc, no prototype examples, no regional variation. That suggests a shared source rather than parallel development. If the structures shared a common origin, they would naturally share a common aesthetic. The consistency becomes evidence of connection rather than coincidence. The demolition pattern adds weight to the hypothesis. Most exposition structures were supposedly temporary, are designed for 18-month lifespans, yet contemporary accounts consistently describe demolition as unexpectedly difficult. The Buffalo foreman's notes aren't unique. Similar documentation exists for Chicago, St. Louis, and portions of the San Francisco Exposition. Demolition crews encountering structural elements that exceeded temporary building standards, foundations that extended far deeper than necessary for short-term structures, material specifications that suggested permanent rather than temporary construction. If these were temporary buildings constructed with inexpensive materials for brief display, demolition should have been straightforward. The documented difficulty suggests they were demolishing something more substantial than the official record admits. Permanent structures being erased, with the demolition records themselves becoming part of the erasure. Then there's the question of the timeline compression. Between 1889 and 1915, the major expositions occurred in Paris, Chicago, Buffalo, St. Louis, and San Francisco. 5 massive construction projects across 3 continents in 26 years, each supposedly built from nothing in construction periods of 18 months to 3 years. The workforce requirements alone create impossibilities when examined in aggregate. To build the Chicago Exposition in the claimed timeline required approximately 14,000 workers. St. Louis required similar numbers. Buffalo's smaller scale still demanded thousands. Where did these workers come from? Skilled artisans, structural engineers, specialty craftsmen, all appearing when needed, then vanishing once the exposition closed, and the labour market records from the period show no unusual influx of construction workers to these cities during the construction periods. The workers should be there in census data, housing records, labour organisation reports. They're not. It's as if the construction happened without the workforce that construction requires, unless the construction didn't happen at all, and the workforce was smaller because the task was adaptation rather than creation. What becomes clear through this analysis is that the official narrative requires us to accept multiple compounding impossibilities, engineering techniques before they were developed, construction timelines that violate workforce mathematics, architectural unity without development period, demolition difficulty that contradicts temporary structure specifications, photographic evidence of pre-existence that archives explain away through recataloguing. Any single anomaly might be explained through special circumstances or exceptional cases. But the pattern persists across every exposition, in every location, through 3 decades of supposedly independent projects. The anomalies aren't exceptions. They're the rule. And that forces an uncomfortable question. What if the rule we've been taught is wrong? What if the 19th century didn't build these structures at all, but inherited them from something we've been trained not to see? Documentation doesn't disappear by accident, especially not documentation that disappears in patterns. The Chicago contractor correspondence vanished into recataloguing in 2003, 21 years ago. The University of Chicago exposition files returned 404 errors in 2011, as the Buffalo demolition foreman's notes were excluded from official reports. The San Francisco photographs were redated when they showed structures before they should exist. That's not random archival loss. That's selective suppression targeting specific types of evidence. And when you track the timeline of these suppressions, another pattern emerges. They cluster in specific decades, suggesting coordinated institutional decisions rather than coincidental neglect. Between 1920 and 1945, municipal archives across North America underwent modernization programs. Chicago, San Francisco, St. Louis, Buffalo all implemented new cataloging systems that required transferring records from old filing systems to updated organizational structures. During these transfers, specific categories of material went missing. Pre-1850 architectural surveys had original building permits for structures officially dated to the 1870s to 1890s, but showing earlier construction dates in contractor records. Photographic collections showing city development that contradicted official growth timelines. The losses were documented in transfer inventories as damaged materials not suitable for preservation or duplicate records consolidated to primary files. But the originals vanished, and the primary files often contained sanitized versions that removed the contradictory evidence. This happened simultaneously across multiple cities, with no apparent coordination between archival institutions. Simultaneous, independent decisions to remove the same types of material following the same justifications. The academic gatekeeping functioned through different mechanisms but achieved identical results. And between 1950 and 1980, multiple graduate students across different universities attempted research into exposition construction anomalies. The Chicago researcher from 2003 wasn't the first. A student at Washington University in St. Louis submitted a thesis proposal in 1967 examining photographic evidence of pre-existing structures at the 1904 exposition site. The proposal was rejected by committee with notation that the research lacked sufficient academic merit for graduate-level investigation. A UC Berkeley student in 1973 attempted analysis of foundation work in Panama-Pacific Exposition photographs. The research was initially approved, then blocked when the advisor was informed that necessary archival materials were unavailable for the proposed research period. Both students left academia without completing degrees, and their preliminary research notes were never published. The pattern repeated at different institutions over 3 decades. Research proposals that questioned official construction timelines were systematically blocked through administrative mechanisms that left no explicit record of censorship, only notes about merit concerns or resource availability. Then there's the material science suppression. Between 1925 and 1955, several independent materials testing laboratories conducted analysis of salvaged exposition materials, examining mortar composition, metalwork joinery, and stone weathering patterns. These were commercial labs, not academic institutions, conducting routine architectural forensics for preservation societies and demolition contractors. And their reports consistently showed material ages and composition techniques inconsistent with official construction dates. The reports were filed with the commissioning clients, then disappeared from company records during subsequent ownership transitions. 3 separate labs, different cities, spanning 3 decades of independent testing, all reaching similar conclusions about material age anomalies, all having their records lost during corporate reorganizations. In one case, the testing lab's complete archives were donated to a historical society in 1962. The donation records show 847 individual analysis reports in the transferred collection. The Historical Society's current database contains 412 reports. The missing 435 reports all date from 1925 to 1940, and all involved exposition materials analysis. And the Historical Society's explanation: the missing reports were likely duplicates or preliminary versions later superseded by final reports, but the donation inventory specifically listed them as final analytical reports with client signatures and billing records. The most explicit suppression involves the photographic evidence itself. The original glass plate negatives from the major expositions still exist in archive collections, but access has been progressively restricted since the 1980s. The Library of Congress Exposition Collection required standard researcher credentials for access until 1987, when it was reclassified as fragile materials requiring special handling procedures. The special handling requires 3 weeks advance notice, limits access to 2 hours per visit, and mandates archive staff supervision during examination. Similar restrictions were implemented at the Missouri Historical Society in 1989, the San Francisco History Center in 1991, and the Buffalo Historical Society in 1994. The restrictions were justified as conservation measures protecting deteriorating materials. But the glass plates from other collections of the same era remained available under standard access procedures. Only exposition materials received the enhanced restrictions, and the restrictions effectively prevented systematic comparative analysis, since researchers would need months of sequential archive visits to examine materials that were previously accessible in days. Why would institutions coordinate to restrict access to 19th century exposition photographs? The standard answer: conservation of valuable historical materials, but glass plate negatives from the same period showing other subjects remain accessible. Library of Congress plates from Civil War documentation, urban development, industrial workplaces, all available under standard procedures. Only exposition materials receive special treatment. Only exposition materials systematically disappeared from municipal archives during modernization programs. Only exposition research proposals faced consistent academic rejection across different institutions. That's not conservation, that's curation. Someone made decisions about what questions could be asked and what evidence could support those questions. Those decisions were made repeatedly, across decades, in institutions with no apparent coordination, yet achieving identical results. And the pattern suggests shared institutional interests rather than independent preservation concerns. And that raises an obvious question. What are these institutions protecting by making the evidence inaccessible? If the exposition structures weren't built in the 1890s, but inherited from an earlier period, that doesn't just change architectural history. It fractures the entire narrative of industrial development and 19th century technological capability. We're taught that the Industrial Revolution represented humanity's leap into advanced manufacturing and construction, that the 19th century saw unprecedented urban growth and architectural achievement, that the structures we associate with that period proved the success of industrialization. But if those structures predated industrialization, then the narrative collapses, and the evidence of progress becomes evidence of inheritance. The triumph of the industrial age becomes successful adaptation of existing infrastructure that we didn't build and don't understand. Consider what that means for the timeline of technological capability. If structures like the Manufacturers Building in Chicago, with its advanced engineering, already existed in the mid-19th century, then someone possessed that engineering capability before the formalization of structural engineering as a discipline, before the mathematical models that made such calculations possible, before the industrial supply chains that could produce the materials at the required scale. That someone built on a scale we attribute to industrial civilization, while existing before industrial civilization, and then that someone vanished from the historical record so completely that we attribute their works to the people who found them. That's not a small gap in historical knowledge. That's a civilizational void where something substantial existed that we've been trained not to see. The architectural unity across continents takes on different implications through this lens. If the exposition structures shared a common origin, then their appearance in Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco suggests a civilization with continental reach, a society capable of building massive permanent structures across thousands of miles with consistent aesthetic and engineering principles. The official history of the 19th century doesn't contain room for such a civilization, and the European empires were expanding but hadn't achieved the level of coordination suggested by this architectural unity. Indigenous American civilizations had been largely destroyed by that point. So who built the infrastructure that the expositions were supposedly demonstrating? Who had the capability to create structures that still challenged demolition crews designed for temporary buildings? And why does every attempt to ask these questions encounter institutional resistance? What we're left with is evidence of systematic erasure covering a civilizational gap. The structures existed. The photographs prove that. The construction timelines don't work. The engineering mathematics confirm that. The documentation disappeared. The archival records show that. And someone built permanent infrastructure across continents before the period we associate with such capability. That infrastructure was relabeled as contemporary construction through the exposition narrative. Then the evidence that would let us see the relabeling was systematically removed from accessible archives. What remains is a mystery that institutions have decided we're not allowed to investigate. And that decision itself becomes part of the evidence. Because you don't suppress investigation into nothing. You suppress investigation into something that threatens foundational narratives, something that would force us to rewrite the story we tell about human development and technological progress, something that suggests we inherited more than we built, and we've spent a century pretending the inheritance was achievement. So where does that leave us? With photographs showing structures that predate their official construction, with engineering that predates the mathematics that made it possible, with coordinated institutional suppression spanning a century, with questions that lead to more questions, none of which have satisfactory answers within the official framework. What civilization built the infrastructure we attribute to the industrial age? How did they achieve engineering feats that still impress modern analysis? Why did they vanish so completely from the historical record? How did the exposition narrative function to relabel their work as contemporary achievement? Who made the decision to suppress the contradictory evidence? Why do institutions continue that suppression today? What else have we inherited and relabeled as achievement? How much of what we call progress is actually recovery? How much of our history is real and how much is carefully constructed narrative? What are we not allowed to know? What would we see if we looked at other 19th century construction through the same lens? How many other structures are we told were built when they were actually found? What happened to the people who built the original structures? Where did they go and why? And most fundamentally, why are we discouraged from asking these questions? The evidence is there. The photographs exist in archives, access restricted but not eliminated. The material analysis reports survived in fragmentary form. The contractor correspondence proved the construction narrative was false before it disappeared into recataloguing. The pattern repeats across continents and decades, too consistent to be coincidence, too systematic to be accident. What we need isn't more evidence. We need permission to look at the evidence we have without institutional gatekeeping, determining which questions are acceptable. We need researchers willing to pursue investigation despite career consequences. We need archives that serve inquiry rather than narrative protection. We need a fundamental willingness to question whether the story we've been told about human development is complete, or whether we've inherited a history that serves institutional interests rather than historical accuracy. This isn't about believing or disbelieving. It's about looking at physical evidence and asking what that evidence actually shows versus what we've been told it shows. The photographs don't lie. The mathematics don't lie. Yet the architectural reality doesn't change based on what narrative we prefer. What changes is our willingness to see what's there rather than what we expect to be there. And right now, institutions have decided we're not allowed to see. They've made that decision through restricted access, suppressed research, disappeared documentation, and systematic dismissal of questions that threaten accepted frameworks. That decision is documented. The suppression is real. The pattern is undeniable. What remains is whether enough people are willing to look past the institutional gatekeeping to see what the evidence actually shows. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once enough people see it, the narrative that required suppression to maintain starts to collapse under its own contradictions. The algorithm will bury this. Share it anyway. Look, the questions matter more than the answers we're not allowed to have.